Thank you for being here. It is a privilege to have you on our second day. And despite all the problems we had yesterday with the first plenary speaker who couldn't make it in person due to the taxi driver strike, and as we told you, our plenary speaker from Brazil who couldn't arrive into the country. Today we have the honor to have as a plenary speaker Dr. Marco Rieckmann from the University of Utrecht in Germany, who is so generous to talk to us in the middle of his summer and his family time. Buenos días a todos y a todas. Es un honor que estén de nuevo con nosotros este segundo día. Ayer, como les contamos, tuvimos dos contingencias con las plenaristas que iban a estar en persona. La doctora Paula Arias, por el problema del paro de los taxistas, no pudo llegar a tiempo. Y la doctora Rosani Pessoa, que no pudo viajar a Colombia porque la aerolínea le exigía el carnet de la fiebre amarilla. Entonces, para iniciar a tiempo, nuestro colega Marco Antonio Peralta, del Grupo de Investigación EALE, va a hacer la presentación del doctor Rieckmann, a quien le agradecemos estar con nosotros. Bienvenido.
Muy buenos días a todos. Bonjour à tous. Bon dia. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. To begin with our second day, today I have the pleasure and great honor to introduce Professor Dr. Marco Rieckmann with the plenary title Education for Sustainable Development Goals, Relevance, Aims, and Didactics. Professor Dr. Marco Rieckmann is from Universität Fechter. He works at the Universität Fechter in the Faculty 1, Department of Education. He has a master in environmental science from Leuphana University of Lüneburg, Germany, and a PhD from the same university. He was the executive environmental science he was the executive coordinator of the UNESCO Chair Higher Education for Sustainable Development at Leuphana University of Lüneburg, Germany. Currently, he is Dean of Studies of Faculty 1 of the Universität Fechter, among other relevant academic work, such as teaching, lectures, publications, etc. His main areas of research and contributions focus on education for sustainable development, global education, sustainable university development, higher education development, competence development and acquisition, teaching and learning processes and methods, sustainable development of higher education institutions. You can see his extensive work at the Universität Fechter webpage. Professor Dr. Marco Rieckmann, guten Tag und willkommen.
Thank you very much. Good morning, buenos días. Ya estaba diciendo antes que voy a hacer la presentación en inglés, pero como ven también hablo más o menos español. Entonces, en cualquier momento que prefieran interactuar en español también sería posible, pero también me dijeron que también les gusta a veces al menos presentaciones, o para algunos más que otros, tal vez presentaciones en inglés. Entonces, la presentación misma voy a hacer en inglés, pero no duden en interactuar también en español. A ver, voy a compartir, si es posible, sí. Ya. Muy bien. En cualquier momento que haya problemas técnicos, algo que no me escuchen bien o algo, por favor, que alguien me avise. Bueno, entonces, well, I have to change the English. So, I will speak, as Marco Antonio already announced, I will speak about the topic of education for the SDGs, which is, if I understood it correctly, also kind of the topic of your meeting, of your international seminar. And I will, speak and give an overview of the relevance, the aims, and pedagogies of education for the Sustainable Development Goals. Thank you very much again for the very kind invitation. And it's a pleasure speaking to you, although I don't not see so much of you. I don't know how many people are there, but I hope that the presentation will be of your interest. I will introduce first the general background of the global situation. I will speak then more about the concept of education for sustainable development, education for the SDGs, and then we'll go into the pedagogical details of the concept, and we then can have a discussion about the concept, its aims, its pedagogies. Well, talking about the international background, I think it's not new to you either that there is different crises. We talk about the planetary boundaries that is related to climate change, to the loss of biodiversity. There are different boundaries, ecological boundaries describing the ecological capacity of the planet. And we can also see in that figure here that especially for climate change, but also for some of the biochemical flows, especially also for genetic diversity, there's problems with these boundaries, meaning that we are crossing, that we are overusing what the planet is offering us. On the one hand. On the other hand, there's also socioeconomic challenges, problems. That figure here is just an example showing the reduction of the number of the poor in many parts of the world, obviously with the pandemics and also now with the war on Ukraine. There has been, especially in Europe, with the with the war, there have been a lot of economic problems. So also poverty may have increased again in some areas of Europe, for example, in Ukraine for sure. In Russia also poverty, I think, because of the effects of the war is increasing. So we could say that after 2017, because that figure here stops in 2017, for some parts of the world, the development may have been differently. But even until 2017, we can see that for many parts of the world, poverty has been reduced, but this blue line here shows that sub-Saharan Africa is not, that is not the case for sub-Saharan Africa. In that part of the African countries, poverty never has been reduced. And recently we see again also more and more inner conflicts, crises in different parts of, especially also, some areas of Africa. So we can say that not only in the ecological dimension, also the socioeconomic dimension, there are many challenges, problems such as, for example, poverty. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously try to change that situation. They describe a future that should be more ecologically friendly, more socially acceptable, let's say in general, more sustainable. And I don't want to present here the details of the goals. I think perhaps you have spoken about them yesterday and you know a lot about the details of the goals. What I would like to stress just is two elements. One element is that I think that the SDGs are especially interesting because they describe more in detail what sustainability can be, at least in Germany. Before the existence of the SDGs, some people, not all, but some people said, sustainability is good, but it's so broad, it's not really clear what sustainability is. And I think there the SDGs really can help to understand more in detail what sustainability is about, because the more than 170, almost 170 sub-goals describe very much in detail what sustainability can be. On the other hand, what I think is also very interesting about the SDGs is the perspective on development, because I would argue that taking the SDGs serious, we could say that we have not even one developed country on the planet. Germany, the United States, Australia, United Kingdom, all these countries should call themselves or should be called also developing countries, as we also have not reached yet the Sustainable Development Goals. So that is also why I personally do not use the terms developed or underdeveloped countries, because I think there are only underdeveloped countries on the planet. So it does not really help that these terms. And as I said, also Germany, I would call also Germany an underdeveloped countries, because with many SDGs, for many SDGs, we still have not achieved what should be achieved until 2030. And we could say that for each country on the planet, they are good, or we are good or better in some areas. For example, for Germany, I would argue that we are more or less good in the energy sector. We are becoming more and more sustainable, more and more relying on renewable energy in the energy sector. We are more or less good in the area of SDG 1. There's not too much poverty in Germany, also not a lot of hunger. But for example, for SDG 13, climate action, I would argue that we are far away from being sustainable, because Germany, for example, still is emitting much too far CO2 emissions. For example, also our cities, SDG 11, are not very sustainable yet. There's also still a lot of problems with gender equality, SDG 5. And for other countries, we could discuss the same. For example, for Colombia, we probably would notice that for some of the SDGs may be better than Germany, and for other SDGs, we may have better ideas or better developments or better transformation already. So the idea here really is, and that is what is described in SDG 17, the idea is really that all countries can learn from each other, because most countries are good in something, are good in one or more of the SDGs, and so the other countries may learn from these countries then. So I think that is already important for educational contexts, really that idea of global partnership, of global learning processes, global processes of communication, learning, and trying out new developments that may be more sustainable. SDG 4 is mainly on education, and so that SDG is especially, well, the SDG 4 in general is about quality education, but in the sub-target or the target 4.7, it is really about education for sustainable development. It says there by 2030, it should be ensured that all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through ESD, through education for sustainable development. So here we really see the focus on ESD. The idea is that in all countries of the world, in all areas of the educational systems, ESD, education for sustainable development, should be implemented. There are different approaches. I think that's quite important. There's not just one idea of education for sustainable development. There are different local or different national understandings, but also even on a global discourse, I would say that there are at least two approaches, two schools. One is more instrumental. We can find that sometimes, for example, in UNESCO documents or NGO documents, where they talk, sometimes also political documents, where they talk about that ESD should provide changes in behavior, should directly influence the behavior of people, should change the ways of thinking of people, so that it leads more or less directly to a more sustainable development. On the other hand, and that I think is much more common in educational contexts and pedagogical contexts, in universities, for example, we talk about a more emancipatory approach of ESD, which is not so much about directly influencing behavior or ways of thinking, but more about empowering, empowering people, about developing competencies, capacities, skills, so that people themselves are more enabled to think critically about different ideas, to try out something, to become active, but not so much that somebody tells them what they have to do, but more that they are really competent, that they are enabled, empowered to be change agents on their own. I will, in my presentation, I will focus much more on the second understanding, the emancipatory approach, although I would argue, and some of you may know German, or at least may know the German terms that we use in education, Erziehung and Bildung. And then we could say that it's like two sides of one coin. The first, more instrumental, is what in Germany would call Erziehung. That's the education, the socialization of young people, where really young people are formed, where young people are brought into society, learn about moral issues, learn how to behave. That in German is called Erziehung, the education for younger people, where education is much more directive, much more like telling people what they have to do. And then the second one is more like Bildung, what in German is a second term for education. That's the advantage in the German language, that we have two words for the English word or the Spanish word education. One being more directive, Erziehung, and one being more about emancipatory approaches, empowerment, more linked to what Wolfgang Klafki says about empowering people, enabling people with education. That is the German word Bildung. And so that are, I think, the two sides, also the two fields of ESD, the more directive, more instrumental way of Erziehung and the more emancipatory of Bildung. And in the following presentation, I will focus, although I think that also in ESD, the instrumental education may play a role. For example, when we tell people in kindergarten, young children, for example, that they shouldn't throw away trash into the forest, that they shouldn't, I don't know, there are many, many things where a more instrumental approach can be important, talking about laws, talking really about things that are dangerous, behavior in mobility context and traffic, using a bicycle, what do you have to do when you go by a bicycle, and there are also cars. I mean, that is something where we have to tell children something that they have to learn, because otherwise it can be dangerous for them or can be damaging for the nature or etc. So I think in ESD, in environmental education, we also need instrumental approaches, especially in early childhood education, but then especially for older learners in school, for higher education students, the emancipatory approach becomes much more important, as I said, where it's about developing their capacities to become change agents, to become critical thinkers, etc. So as my field is more higher education, and I discuss ESD and environmental education more for the field of higher education, I will in the following focus more on that emancipatory approach, which I think is the most appropriate approach also for older learners, for example, for higher education students. So based on that background, I would say that education for sustainable development aims then to promote the development of key competencies or generic skills. Both terms are used internationally. In Germany, we use more the term competencies, but in some contexts also skills is a used term. So it is about key competencies, generic skills, which enable individuals to contribute to sustainable development. I will use now also a UNESCO document for describing a little bit more in detail which competencies I'm thinking about. And that's the document on education for the Sustainable Development Goals, a document that me and my team developed some years ago for UNESCO. We elaborated the draft as lead authors, Lisa Mint, Senegardena, and I, and then that document was published by UNESCO. And in that document, if you don't know it, I recommend to get it. It's available in English, it's available in French, in other languages, but also in Spanish. So using that link, for example, you come to a website where you can choose different languages, for example, Spanish, and then can download that document, for example, in Spanish. And I will tell you now a little bit what it is about. In that document, the idea is described that education for sustainable development can enable learners, individuals, to contribute to achieving the SDGs by equipping them with knowledge. The document is also about different concepts, different knowledge elements that should be developed related to the different 17 SDGs, but it is also about competencies that are needed not only to understand what the SDGs are about, but also to become engaged in promoting the transformation needed. And in that document, how many are there? Eight key competencies are described, and that are the key competencies I was talking about that are really crucial for ESD, for environmental education and sustainability education. The idea is that these key competencies are developed transversally in school education, in higher education, well, beginning even already in early childhood education, but then going on, continuing in school education, higher education, adult education. These cross-cutting, transversal key competencies should be developed. And I will use a figure by Bruniers et al. For describing what these competencies are about. The idea here is that we live in a very complex world. And sustainability a lot is about complexity. Complex interrelations concerning climate change, globalization, inflation, wars, armed conflicts. So there are many environmental, social, economic issues that are interrelated. And so learners need to develop system thinking so that they can understand the complexity, can analyze the different interrelations, can try to find solutions, etc. But it's not only about the present, it's also about the future. For example, how could be the future of Ukraine? How could be the future related to climate change issues? How will the climate change develop in the future? How will the climate be in the future? So these are very relevant questions from a sustainability perspective. And so learners should also develop future thinking competencies so they can think about the future. How could the future be? What is probable? What is possible? What is desirable? What do we want? How do we want the future to be? That are important questions that need specific also skills, capacities to think about these questions. And then for the present as well for the future, it's also about values. What do we really want? What is more sustainable in our point of view? How just has the society to be? How much do we take into account nature, the rights of nature? How important are animals? Do we want to eat animals or do we don't want to kill animals? For example, in contexts of food, is it okay for us to kill animals, to have meat, or do we don't need meat? All those questions are also related to our values and attitudes. And so here it says that it's also about being able to map and understand different values, but also to apply values, reconcile, negotiate values. And so that is what we call value thinking competence. And then the question is, if, for example, a student is able to analyze different systems, to think about the future, to negotiate, understand values, but then they may also be interested in becoming active. And there it's where we need strategies. So the student should be able to develop ideas, strategies that could be applied. Then probably they want to do it in a group and not alone. There may be several students, for example, that want to become active jointly. So that is where they need interpersonal competence to act in a group. And then in the end, it's about really implementing change to become active. And there it is where they need implementation or action competence. And in the end, we could say that it's also a lot about their emotions, about their feelings, about their frustrations, their hope, their fear. So they also need something like intrapersonal competence. So they have to be able to reflect their own, to cope with their own fears, for example, their own frustrations, etc. So that is where they also need intrapersonal competence. And so the idea is that in all study programs at universities or already in school education, all these cross-cutting competencies are somehow developed, obviously not in 1 month, not in 1 school year, not in 1 semester at university. It's a longer process, starting in early childhood education, continuing in school education, continuing in higher education, and then hopefully at the end of higher education, students at least have developed all these competencies to a certain level already, and then by informal, non-formal, lifelong learning processes at the workplace, in their families, via a capacity building, even after higher education, after finishing higher education, these learning processes may go on. So I really would describe it also as lifelong learning process. We will not say that a student has developed these competencies and then it's finished, then it's over, then ESD has done its job. No, it's really a lifelong learning process. This competence development can always go on, also for a person that is already 50 or 60 or 70 years old or even older. Still, those persons may go on developing also their sustainability competencies, also because the world is changing, different crises appear, different problems have to be solved. So also these competencies always have to be continued in their development. But also, especially in higher education, in school education, we as teachers, as university teachers, as school teachers, we play a very important role in creating settings where the students can further develop, as I said, not to a level of 100%, but can further develop these competencies so that they have a higher level of competencies finishing, for example, a study program at university as they had when they entered the study program. But it's not only about competencies or skills. As I said, I use here the term competencies because it's very common in the international discourse on ESD, but some also would call it sustainability literacy or sustainability skills, and some even also would call it sustainability capabilities. There are different terms in English. I use here the term competencies. But it's not only about competencies, it's also about, as I said before, values as part of the value thinking competency. But also beyond that, I would argue that besides competence development, value change, value development is a very important part of ESD. That is sometimes also called transformative education. Transformative education meaning that a conceptual change takes place, that the fundamental orientations, meaning values, attitudes, etc., are changed through education. And here, for example, we could say that in ESD, it's very important that learners learn about the importance of the conservation of natural resources, human dignity, justice, that are really basic or crucial or key values of sustainability. So somehow part of ESD should be that learners really learn about these different values and really, perhaps even change their values and their attitudes in line with these sustainability values. But then also taking into account the emancipatory approach, again, this more open approach, it's also not only about transmitting specific values, it's also about value clarification, that learners learn about different values in our society and other societies, so that there also can be a critical discourse on different values. For example, comparing what is important in Colombia, what is important in Germany, what are the advantages or disadvantages of certain values, certain focuses on different values. And so then the learners can also reflect on their own values, their society's values, and can take a stand on them, perhaps also change their values, or at least broaden their horizon of values. And that is what may lead to that conceptual change, and what then would be called transformative education. How can we do that? How can we create settings for competence development and value orientation, value development? I would argue, in line with UNESCO, that an action-oriented transformative pedagogy is very important. We need to focus on the learners. We need to open up spaces where the learners can act, where they can try out things, can reflect on what they are doing, Also, it may be settings of transgressive learning, disruptive learning, where really dominant ideas in a society are critically reflected, really alternatives are thought and tried out, but it's also about participation, about discovering, connecting, networking. What also is very important is the vision orientation, so to think about the future, to open up spaces where students can discuss, can learn about the future, because often in school, I don't know in Colombia, but at least in Germany, for school education, often it's more about the past in historical activities, for example, history classes, or about the present in geography, in religious education, in biology. It's often about the past or the present, but not so much about the future. So I would argue here that school, but also high education, should be much more about the future. We need much more vision orientation. So meaning that we have spaces where students can discuss about the future, can create ideas for the future, can reflect on possible future developments. And methods that are in line with these pedagogical principles of an action-oriented transformative pedagogy are, for example, projects, all kinds of collaborative, real-world projects. So projects like service learning projects where students can offer a service. For example, higher education students, university students may create a project for the community, for a specific group of the community, may collaborate with an NGO, an environmental group. At University of Fechter, for example, at the moment, we have been running a course where students are collaborating with climate change offices of different regional communities, etc. Also, students may run a campaign or do any other kind of project where they then obviously can learn a lot about sustainability, but also probably will develop their competencies in system thinking, in implementing, in future issues, etc. Especially for the latter, for the future competence, very important are all kind of vision building exercises like future workshops, scenario development, utopian thinking or storytelling, science fiction thinking. So we need all these different kinds of methods that help us to or make it possible to think about the future. What is also important is different methods of analysis of complex systems, like research projects or case studies, or different kinds of analysis of actors, stakeholders, systems, modeling, so that really students can learn about the complexity, the different relations, and also methods based on critical and reflective thinking, like fishbowl discussions or other dialogue formats, reflective journals that really can facilitate debate and dialogue. Obviously, that is not a complete list of methods. It's just some examples how practically ESD can look like. What is also important here is that ESD is not only about creating pedagogical settings in the classroom or in projects, it's also about changing the institution. It's about that educational institutions like universities or schools should become places of learning for sustainable development, meaning that sustainability really should be integrated not only in the classroom activities and the pedagogical projects, but also in the operation, the organizational culture. For example, in the university canteen or the university administration, the campus management, the way which energy or how energy is used, the forms of learner participation, the way how the university is led, leadership and management, the governance processes, also the relations with the community, really to make sustainability also part of the cooperation and relations with the community. All that could be done because on the one hand, it's helpful for bringing forward the sustainability transformation. It's a good also a role model if a university, for example, uses more sustainable its energy or uses renewable energies, etc. And that is kind of a role model for learners, but also for the community. But it also opened up more spaces for informal learning. and creates more consistency between what is taught and what is done in the projects, the classroom activities on the one hand, and what students can experience on campus. For example, it would be a bit, well, not a big catastrophe, but perhaps a bit problematic or at least disturbing for students if, for example, in classroom activities, they learn about sustainability and then they go on campus, go for some food, go for a drink on campus, and only can buy Coke and other perhaps non-sustainable products. And they cannot find any fair trade or any organic or any in other ways sustainable food. So there it's really about creating consistency, creating also spaces where, for example, a student can go to a kiosk, a canteen, a restaurant, whatever on campus or close to campus, gets there, for example, a drink or food, and can experience perhaps also new ways of, for example, vegan food or vegetarian, or not necessarily it has to be vegan or vegetarian, but also in other ways, sustainable, fair traded coffee, fair traded tea or whatever, so that also students can perhaps try out, and not only students, also teachers and all members, administrative staff, all members of university could be part of those learning processes, those processes of experiencing sustainability on campus. And that is what we call the whole institution approach, that sustainability is not only part of pedagogical activities, but really of the whole institution, so that the institution as such becomes a place of experience, of learning, becomes a place for also informal learning for sustainability. Now I would like to come almost for the last part already to teacher education in a broader sense, teacher education for school teachers, but also perhaps the teacher education for university teachers, because I would focus a little bit more on the questions also how teachers have to be prepared for sustainability in ESD. In general, we can say that teacher education plays a significant role for advancing ESD. Supporting teachers has been already in the past and the present a key condition to the successful adoption and implementation of ESD, for example, in the ESD decade. Also ESD, also in the ESD for 2030 program, which is actually currently run by UNESCO, there is a key action area aiming to strengthen the capacity of educators, trainers, and other change agents to become learning facilitators. So we also see that UNESCO is also seeing that as a key priority, that teachers, any kind of teachers, educators, have to be better prepared for working with ESD. And that means also that those teachers, and it doesn't matter if school teachers or university teachers, we need to be competent. On the one hand, we as teachers also should develop the sustainability competencies I was talking about already. We also don't have to be experts. We don't have to develop all these competencies to an expert level. But I think if we are not at all good in system thinking, in critical thinking, in vision building, how will we develop these competencies in our students? So at least to a certain level, we also as teachers have to become sustainable competent. But furthermore, we also need to develop ESD competencies, because just being a good critical thinker or just being a good future thinker does not mean that I'm able to teach that or to develop that competence in other people. That's always the same, right? Also a person that is good in speaking English not necessarily is a good English teacher. A genie in genetics or engineering not necessarily is a good engineering teacher. That's always the same for all fields, and that is also true for sustainability. Just because somebody knows about sustainability, or just because somebody has developed very well sustainability competencies, does not mean that that person is a good sustainability or ESD teacher. So we also have to develop those kind of pedagogical ESD competencies. There are different approaches that internationally have developed. I don't want to go into the details here. I just would like to show you very briefly that in an international project, we have developed also a framework called Round Sense of Purpose. It's a framework for ESD competencies, which describes that educators need a critical understanding of sustainability in ESD, needs a grounding in the pedagogy of ESD, and also abilities really to practice, to implement an action-oriented transformative pedagogy. You may have a look into it in more detail later. Here, I just want to say that there are 12 competencies that we describe as these ESD competencies. You can find them in detail on the RSP website, and there's also a publication where they are described in detail. I just want to give you an example here. For example, for the future competence, which says that the teacher or the educator should be able to help learners to explore alternative possibilities for the future and to use these to consider how behaviors might need to change. That is future competence. So, but what does that mean in detail? If you go then to the website, for example, and click into that future competence, then you find some information what that means for the learners. Here, some learning objectives are described. The learners should be able to envision a range of futures, should be able to identify and analyze steps that would be needed to take to reach desired possible future scenarios, etc., etc. So you would find here more details what it means for the students, what should they develop, which capacities, which skills, but you find also information what does that mean for the teacher. Here, for example, saying that the teacher, for developing those learning objectives in the students, would have to be able to use future studies techniques, such, for example, simulation games, future newspapers, or others. That does not mean that all teachers have to be good in all those elements, but, for example, thinking about a school, we would say that in the school, some teachers at least should know about simulations, or some teachers should know about scenario technique, or some teachers should know about future newspaper method or other future-oriented methods, so that in the team, in the school activities, at least students have the chance, while working with different teachers, to develop the different competencies. You find more details on the website, also for practical activities that can be used to develop the different competencies. For coming to an end, I just would like to give examples how we work at the University of Vechta with those concepts. For example, myself, I teach in the Master of Education. That is the master where the school teachers are trained, because in Germany, as people can work as teacher in a school only after finishing a master. So they first do the bachelor degree in education, then they do the Master of Education, and then they can start working in a school as a teacher. So I have the master students here that are almost finishing the master program and then will become teachers. And in that course, they can work with me on ESD. And for example, in that course, I use that way of action-oriented working, because it's not a theory-related course. Well, it is about theory. The student learn about ESD theories, about the different aims and methods. But then what we do is that in groups, they have to develop ESD concepts, ESD lessons, projects. They do not apply it because we do not have the space or the possibilities in that course. But at least on paper, like a concept note, they develop an idea, a lesson plan. We also could say they develop a lesson plan or a project plan, how ESD could be implemented in a specific school subject, in a specific school project. So that is, for example, one example how I am working in a course for teacher students, Master of Education, and I train them in developing lesson plans, in developing ideas, how ESD can be implemented at school. And I do it using an action-oriented way where we do not only read text or discuss about it or do presentations, but where they really have to practically develop ideas how they could implement it. And also while preparing that and while learning about ESD, I also use methods like future workshops or other methods for the course development, but in the same moment, for them, it's also for learning about the methods and learning practice of this. The second and last example, in another course, which was about sustainability on campus, the students learn first about sustainability, what can be a sustainable university. So they also learned about some theories, some concepts. We read texts, we discussed, we had some discourses, etc., debates. And then in the end, the students got the task to find one sustainability problem on campus, and to develop a project for solving that problem. And here in that case, it was a project that really had to be developed in practice. Just to give you some examples, for example, one student group identified the problem of trash, of plastics on campus, and collected plastics on campus, bottles and other trash plastics, and then created an exhibition just in the main building of the university for showing that problem, for informing people about it. We may call it a memorial against plastic in the sea. They also related to the issue of that in the end, that plastic that is on campus can get into a river, can that get to the sea, and then really it creates also that problem of plastic islands, a big amount of plastic in the sea. Another project was about a workshop where students showed other students how they can clean their house or their kitchen using sustainable materials, sustainable substances instead of chemicals. And another group, for example, created a campaign that was about paper, about using less paper, for example, using the double side function at the copying machines, etc., for saving paper. And the last example I want to give you is a project that was about the SDGs and about different elements of mobility, of water related to the SDGs. And again, in that course, you can see it's not only about knowledge, it's really about applying. It's about trying out things. It's about that students really can try out, can implement sustainability so that they really can develop the practical sustainability competencies. Well, yeah, I would have here a short example of a school, but I think I switched that also for time reasons, so that we still have some time for discussion and questions. Perhaps I just say in 1-2 sentences that is an example of a school that really includes the SDGs in all their activities. They almost do not teach any more subjects. They do not have any more separated biology, chemistry, and whatever subjects and classroom activities. They work in projects. They work in teams. For example, here we would have the theme 5.4, which is called environmental researches. For example, in that course or in that project, they do environmental research. And in that research, they learn about biology, geography. They even may do it in English and learn about English, new English vocabulary. So that's a very radical, and always when I tell it about that school in Germany, many people are confused because generally schools in Germany are more traditional. Schools in Germany most often still work in the 45 minutes, then a break, then again 45 minutes, then a break, and it's first German class, then English class, then sports or physical education. So schools in Germany are quite traditional, almost work in the same way they did 100 years ago, only that now we have computers, but the way of teaching is sometimes very similar, and maybe similar in Colombia, that also sometimes school is still like it was 100 years ago. But in that school, they really do it totally different. They don't have that rhythm of 45 minutes break, 45 minutes break. They don't have separated subjects anymore. They really work based on sustainability problems. And I think that's a very interesting way and very interesting vision how also school education may change based on the ideas of education for sustainable development. For coming to a conclusion, I would like to conclude that sustainability transformation is very much needed. That is something we can see every day with burning woods in Australia, burning woods in Canada. We had just very strong floods in the last days in Austria and Slovenia. People died, total villages were destroyed by flooding, by water. We have too hot weather in Spain, just to mention some examples from Europe where I know more about it. We really can see climate change now every day. There's a lot of catastrophes, of flooding, of strong winds, of too much heat in areas that always have been hot, but now they are even much more hot, and more people die because it's just too hot, especially for older people. So we can see sustainability transformation is very much needed. And I would say ESD cannot solve that problem, not alone. Changes in policy are needed, changes in the economy are needed, and that cannot be solved by the schools or the universities on their own, because we also need changes in policy in the economy now, today, tomorrow. We cannot wait only for education, but education can contribute. Education can contribute to empower students, to enable students. And crucial here is really that we use that whole institution approach, and also that we prepare teachers that they are ESD competent so that they can work with all these topics. And for example, can change schools, can change universities to better learning places for sustainability. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions, also critical reflections, etc. Thank you very much.
Professor Dr. Rieckmann, thank you very much. 3 years ago, more or less, this was a dream to have you here in this seminar. I discussed with the EALE research group, and today is a dream come true, right? Thank you very much for your special participation in this event. And we are going to open the room for questions. And yesterday, talking with the school director of languages, and he told me or asked me, okay, how can we integrate ESD into the classroom? So I know you mentioned so many ideas about this topic, and just to be being practical, probably 2 or 3 things, special things that you consider, because we are running out of time based on the Agenda 2030. We are in 2013, finishing this year. We have just 6 years. So what could be those 2 or 3 special things we need to start doing into our classroom with the curricula, even in the university or different programs, to start working with this ESD topic in our different subjects?
Well, I think I would just hand the ball, let's say, back to you, and would just repeat what you just said. I think important is starting, because if we think we are not doing enough, we should do it faster, we should do more. Yes, that's true. We always can do more. We always can do better. But I think we shouldn't be frustrated, or we shouldn't be too negative about that. Perhaps we should have not reached enough yet. I think what really important is starting. And if we have started already, to go on, to create more activities. And I think many examples, for example, of university shows that sometimes the start, or also of schools, show that sometimes the start can be a small activity in one subject, in one study program, or even only in one module, one course of one study program. It's perhaps 1 or 2 teachers that are already doing something, but then perhaps they can convince colleagues. Obviously, what is very helpful, but I know that probably most of you are teachers, and perhaps not so many of you are working in political administration. What obviously can be very important is also to change regulations, to change laws. That is something that we can see, for example, here in Lower Saxony, and I think that's a very good example. Lower Saxony is the state of Germany where Vechta is based. And what we can see here, for example, in Lower Saxony, schools have worked a lot with ESD already for more than 20 years. And we have had very much good developments, many teachers that are motivated, many students that are motivated, many ESD projects. But still it was like, yeah, more the motivated teachers do it, more the motivated schools do it, but not all. What then happened is that 2 years ago, the state ministry of Lower Saxony, the Ministry of Education, published a regulation saying that all schools, all public schools, general or vocational schools in Lower Saxony have to implement ESD. And they do not have to do it only in biology or geography classes. They have to implement ESD in all subjects, in all school activities. You can imagine, and if you don't can imagine, I tell you that that has really created a big change, because now all schools, even those that perhaps before were not too interested, say, okay, we have to do it, so now let's do it. And for example, I sometimes offer capacity building courses for school teachers. 5 years ago, it was quite difficult. We offered courses sometimes, but there was not a lot of demand. Not because teachers were not interested, also because there were other priorities. I mean, if there is also digitalization and inclusive education and so much pressure on teachers that they have to do it, sometimes perhaps they would be interested in sustainability, but they just say, well, but I also have to improve in digitalization. I also have to be improve in inclusive education. So there's my priority. Sustainability comes later. But now with that state law saying that all schools, all subjects, all teachers have to do it, obviously there's much more pressure, and that means that there's much more demand. Now I offer school training or training for school teachers every 2 or 3 months, and there are always 15, 20, 30 teachers attending those courses. So I just would like to say, do what you can do, go on with the activities. But if in any way it's possible also to influence regulations, university regulation, talk to the president or rector, or try to convince the faculty, the dean, try to convince the university board, or even better, if some of you work in policy administration, for example, at the level of a city government or state government, I think that is even also very important, because obviously also when a regulation for the whole state of Antioquia, for example, or for the city of Medellin, makes it compulsory that all schools have to do it, obviously that will be a change that is much more faster than just individual activities of convinced schools or convinced teachers. But even if it's not possible to create such regulations or laws, I think important is to go on. And what is also very important, I would like to stress that again, the change does not depend on us. I think that is, as teachers, I think that is really important to understand. I think it's wrong when we or politicians or any person says sustainability will only become true if education changes. Yes, it is an element, but I think it's totally wrong to put the main pressure or the main responsibility on education, because that is not what education is for. Education is for educating people, for developing people, but not the main issue of education should be to solve problems that politicians are not able to solve. There are presidents, there are mayors, there are senators that nowadays should change the problem, and they could do it. Because they, even if they are not very competent, and some of them are really stupid, just mentioned Donald Trump. I mean, I wouldn't expect from him to do anything good. He's just an idiot. But there are politicians that are more or less competent, and they could do something today, or they could do something tomorrow. So we never should fall in that trap, listening to them when they say, but I can't do it, I cannot do it because people are not educated. That's totally wrong. Any president, any state government could do much more today or tomorrow. But that does not mean that we can accompany that process. We can also support it by doing sustainability educational activities.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rieckmann. I think we don't have time for more questions. We will have a question, just one or two, probably. Remember, it could be in Spanish also. Okay, there is one question. Okay. Just one question. And I think with this question we are finishing. We are running.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Dr. Rieckmann. This is Juan Manuel Perez. I work with the translation program here at Universidad de Antioquia in Medellin. And looking at your presentation, well, many questions came to my mind, but I would like to ask you a very short question, and it has to do, yesterday we had a presentation by one of the professors of Universidad de Antioquia as well. She talked about climate change and the climate crisis. And one of the ideas that she shared with us was that at this point in this climate crisis, one thing is very clear, that the poorest or the less developed countries, or the countries that pollute less, let's say, are the ones that have the highest consequences, that face the worst consequences of this climate crisis, and vice versa. And the countries that pollute more are less affected for this crisis. How can we, as teachers, tell, for example, our students here at Universidad de Antioquia or in any other less developed country, tell them from an ethical point of view, well, you need to implement this sustainability approach, be more sustainable, and how can we tell them, our students and also your students in more developed countries, how can we give them this idea of maybe you need to do more, while they are seeing that the consequences are not equal, and the production of pollution, for example, is not equal in these two worlds we live in, to say so. I don't know if I make myself clear with the question.
Yeah, I totally understand. And I try to be brief. It's a big point and an important point, and I have discussed it in several contexts. I think it's a question or a point that often is made and that is very important. Trying to be brief, I would say that first, I totally agree. There are different responsibilities. There's a shared global responsibility, but shared responsibility does not mean that all countries or all people have the same responsibility. Obviously, countries like Germany or USA or Australia or others have contributed much more to the climate change that is occurring already. And so I totally agree with, like, for example, President Lula's idea, or also the idea of the Colombian president, Gustavo, how's he called, Petro? No, I cannot remember, sorry, the name, but I read just today on newspaper that also the Colombian president was...
Yes, Petro.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So I was also reading that, for example, the Colombian president, but also President Lula from Brazil are suggesting or have been suggesting in the context of the Amazon Rainforest Conference the last days that it would be necessary that the northern countries, the global north, pays much more money also for conserving, for example, the rainforest. And that is one issue where we would say, or where, for example, President Lula says, you are Germany, United States, you are contributing much more to climate change. So please, if you also need the rainforest, you also have to invest more money to save the rainforest. So I totally agree with you. There is that different responsibility. And I think in ESD, yes, students should learn about that. And I thank you also for that point, because I think it makes also important, shows also that education for sustainability should not only be consumer education. It should not only be about how can you consume, what can you do, how can you change your consumption. It should also be political education, meaning that students also learn about political systems, about political approaches, about global policy, about global power relations, about also global injustice, and that they learn also how to influence it, that they cannot only be sustainability in a supermarket, but that they also can take part in protests, in global initiatives, etc. So I think that is really important, that students also, that ESD is also political education. Just the last comment, because I just read that a comment here in the chat saying that sometimes it may be different in peripheral countries with poor infrastructure, poor working conditions, and students also coming from underprivileged backgrounds. Yes, obviously, I totally agree that sometimes ESD may not be the first step. Sometimes it may be more important to create first quality of education, to create quality infrastructure, and then, or parallel, or perhaps as a second step, ESD also may be possible. That would be a first answer to that comment. And the second one would be, I would not say that it is less important for underprivileged students. I think especially for them, and there we can connect it to the previous question or previous comments, I think especially for less privileged students, it's even more important to be involved in ESD if we understand ESD not mainly only as climate change education, etc., but especially also as political education, because then it is about empowerment, it is about the rights, and then we can connect it, then we can connect ESD also very well to the ideas of Paulo Freire, to the idea of liberating people, of empowering people. So, and I think there it connects very well, saying, yeah, it is not only environmental education, it's not only, it is mainly also about empowering people, about showing people their rights and developing their competencies so that they also can struggle or even fight for their rights and for global justice, or also for local justice. I think that's very important here. Thank you very much. I understand that my time is over, but that's also totally fine, because I also have to leave. My family is waiting for me, and so yeah, still have a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. You're very kind for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Okay, thank you as well.